Silence is supposed to feel peaceful, yet when it follows a connection with a self-absorbed person, it strikes like a psychological shock wave. One day, the noise quits, the disorder quits, and suddenly you're left by yourself with the truth you didn't want to notice. And here's the twist. That quiet time doesn't just expose them. It exposes you, your typical behaviors, your hurt, and your strength. But what happens next is far from balanced. The quiet impacts you both, but in two entirely separate realities. If this is making sense already, take a moment and share this with someone who's trying to separate themselves. They require this clear understanding today, not tomorrow. When both you and the self-absorbed person stop contacting each other, the very first thing that develops inside their mind is a deep feeling of being lost. Not because they miss you or because they are thinking about the connection, but because the predictable flow of attention, reaction, and emotional response they depended on has suddenly disappeared. Self-absorbed people construct their emotional world around control, and for them, control is maintained through constant back and forth. Whether that interaction is affectionate, arguing, dramatic, disorganized, or even hostile, as long as there is contact, they feel connected to a sense of importance. Quiet, however, snaps that connection immediately. It removes the trigger they use to manage their self-importance. They don't know where you stand, what you are considering, whether you are suffering, whether you have moved forward, or whether someone else is now taking up the space they once dominated. That doubt doesn't create sadness, it creates unease. Their confusion often shows up as annoyance, restlessness, or a rapid mental review of past events, looking for the moment they lost charge of the story. This is why your quiet seems much louder to them than anything you ever stated. It disrupts the pattern they rely on. Self-absorbed people anticipate that even if you pull back, you will eventually come back with a message, a query, an explanation, or a reaction. They depend on the emotional pull they think they naturally possess. But when nothing arrives, not even a small sign, it creates a break in their exaggerated view of themselves. They begin to experience a wound to their ego, not because of the connection's emotional worth, but because quiet reveals their lack of influence. This is the moment they start internally pacing, building reasons that protect their pride. They might convince themselves you are being overly emotional, that you will eventually break the quiet, or that you are simply attempting to punish them. But beneath this story is a silent panic, an internal scramble to get back the advantage. Quiet from you forces them to face the one thing they endlessly try to avoid. The awareness that their power over you may not be as total as they thought. When the quiet begins, something subtle but deep starts happening inside you. Although you may not notice it initially, your body, which has been functioning in a heightened emotional state for months or years, finally receives a signal that the constant threat, confusion, and emotional unpredictability are no longer there. Your nerve system doesn't immediately cheer. It slowly relaxes, cautiously, as if checking repeatedly to confirm that the difficulty has truly ended. This is because relationships with self-absorbed people train your brain to expect argument, criticism, withdrawal, or sudden mood changes. Your entire internal state becomes focused on extreme alertness, looking for the next problem. But when the contact stops, the system that was always preparing for impact begins to ease. At first, this shift often feels uncomfortable, even scary. Disorder becomes familiar. Quiet can feel unfamiliar. Your body may interpret peace as emptiness, stillness as danger, and calm moments as possible traps. But slowly, something changes. Your thoughts begin to linger rather than clash. You start reflecting instead of reacting. The emotional capacity that was once used up by dealing with their moods and anticipating their next move becomes available for you once more. You notice small things like the absence of tension in your jaw or the slower rate of your breathing. Your sleep might improve, your hunger might even out, and you might realize how truly exhausted you were. This restoration isn't dramatic. It's not accompanied by big revelations. Instead, it feels like returning to yourself in small pieces. A little more clarity here, a little more balance there. You stop over-explaining. You stop practicing conversations in your head. You stop preparing yourself for the next guilt trip or emotional surprise attack. And without recognizing it, the energetic burden you were carrying begins to lift. The quiet becomes less like a hole and more like room to take a breath, with no incoming emotional manipulation, no sudden difficulty, and no psychological power struggle. Your nerve system finally begins to reset. You are no longer working in survival mode. You begin to experience what it feels like to exist without constantly arguing for peace or preparing for the next break. This is the beginning of recovery, even if it feels unstable at first. When the quiet extends beyond what the self-absorbed person anticipated, something deeper begins to turn on inside them: ego injury. This is not sadness, and it is not distress over losing the connection. It is a direct blow to their feeling of importance and command. In their world, attention is vital, approval, reaction, emotional responsiveness. These are the tools they use to keep their ego high and their internal emptiness soothed. When both of you stop contacting each other, the self-absorbed person initially assumes it's short-term. But as the quiet continues, the lack of attention starts to feel like a personal offense. They expected you to pursue, to question, or to emotionally break down without their presence. Your quiet becomes a challenge to their importance. This ego injury often shows up as annoyance, anger, or a feeling of being unfairly treated. They may replay past discussions, not because they miss them, but to confirm to themselves that they had the upper hand. They look for times where they believe they were better, in charge, or wanted, and they use those recollections to mend the sudden break in their self-image. But the truth is that quiet threatens them because it takes away their ability to manage their feelings through outside command. Without attention, they start falling into feelings they work tirelessly to avoid: lack of importance, weakness, and shame. These emotions are unbearable to them, so they quickly change them into fault. In their mind, you become the issue, the ungrateful one, the difficult one. This change in viewpoint is their mental defense. At the same time, the lack of reaction denies them the emotional fuel they need to feel alive. Self-absorbed people depend on impact. They want to feel that their presence, even their absence, can deeply affect you. But when you don't reach out, when you don't react, when you don't attempt to fix things, they lose the sense of power they thought they had. This is where ego injury becomes unease. They may check your social media, ask shared friends, or invent stories to guard themselves from the simple truth that their control is slipping. What they cannot stand is the idea that you might be moving forward without them, because that challenges the entire foundation of who they believe they are. As the days of quiet go by, something begins to shift inside you that the self-absorbed person never foresaw. The confusion begins to clear up. When you are in the relationship, especially one marked by manipulation, emotional inconsistency, or constant dismissal, your understanding becomes twisted. You start questioning what is real, minimizing your own needs, and overly making up for their lack of effort. Your emotional energy is spent putting out fires they started, fixing damage they caused, or explaining yourself in endless conversations. In that state, it's difficult to see the imbalance clearly. But quiet breaks that pattern. Without their constant influence, your mind starts putting together pieces you couldn't connect before. You begin noticing how much emotional work you were doing. The calming, the apologizing, the anticipating, the fixing, the smoothing over. You see how many situations you excused, how many boundaries you gave up, and how many times you ignored your own discomfort just to keep temporary peace. As the distance increases, so does your understanding. It becomes simpler to recognize the patterns you were caught in. You see the subtle trickery, the shifting blame, the purposeful affection that always came with conditions. The times where you felt guilty for wanting basic respect now feel unreal. You start realizing that what you were calling love was often survival, adjustment, or hope dressed up as patience. The confusion clearing up isn't dramatic. It happens quietly in moments of recognition. You recall a comment that felt wrong, a moment when you felt ignored, a conversation where you said sorry even though you did nothing incorrect. These memories start lining up, and the story becomes understandable in a way it never could when you were still emotionally tangled. This understanding isn't just intellectual, it's emotional. You stop making the good moments seem better than they were because you can finally see what they cost you. You recognize the cycles you were trapped in, the breakdown of your self-worth, and the way you kept making yourself smaller to keep a connection that was fundamentally unequal. What appears in this quiet is a more honest version of the truth, a truth that was always present, but was impossible to access when your energy was spent just trying to keep the relationship working. Once the quiet settles in, and the self-absorbed person realizes you are not returning to the old ways, a different behavior begins below the surface, silent watching. This is not done with affection or interest, it's driven by their need to judge whether they still hold mental importance in your life. Self-absorbed people rarely let go entirely, even when they seem disconnected. Instead, they shift into observation mode. They want to know if you are suffering, if you are moving on, if you are posting something that hints at regret, or if someone else is now giving you the attention they used to control. Watching becomes their method of keeping a sense of command without breaking the quiet that protects their pride. They may not message you, but they'll observe your online activity with more focus than you would expect. They check your profile views, your stories, your followers, or your posts, looking for proof that confirms their importance or threatens their self-image. They might ask shared friends subtle questions, pretending to be uninterested while searching for signs that you are still emotionally connected to them. They might dwell on old messages or pictures, not because they feel tender, but because they want to reassure themselves that you once valued them and might still be affected by their absence. Watching becomes a silent check on your emotional state. This behavior is based in insecurity. The self-absorbed person needs to confirm that their place in your life hasn't been erased. If they see you doing well, they feel threatened. If they see you quiet, they interpret it as waiting. If they see you posting something positive, they may view it as putting on a show. Everything becomes information interpreted through the viewpoint of their ego. Their monitoring doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It's subtle, quiet, and often disguised as lack of interest, but it is their way of keeping the connection alive on their own terms. What they are looking for is confirmation that you are still within their emotional pull. They want confirmation that even in quiet, they continue to affect your thoughts or your heart. Silent watching gives them the false belief of power without requiring vulnerability or responsibility. It is their way of staying present without being seen, maintaining importance, without offering anything genuine. As the quiet continues, something begins happening inside you that the self-absorbed person never considered. Your true self starts returning to its original form. When you are in a relationship marked by manipulation, inconsistency, or emotional control, your sense of self becomes changed without you even realizing it. You adjust to their moods, you silence your needs, you change yourself to avoid argument, and you shrink parts of who you are to maintain the peace. Your true self becomes shaped around their expectations, their reactions, and their emotional instability. But quiet breaks that shape. Without their voice in your ear, without their criticisms, without their praise that always came with strings attached, you start hearing your own voice once more. This process is subtle. It begins with small preferences reappearing. You start remembering what music you genuinely enjoy, what routines make you feel calm, what boundaries used to be necessary for you. You find yourself making choices that are based on your own needs, rather than on anticipating someone else's reactions. You reclaim areas of mental space that were once filled with overthinking and self-doubt. You begin trusting your instincts again because there is no longer someone present who constantly undermines them. Your emotional state slowly shifts from managing someone else's disorder to reconnecting with your own internal rhythm. You notice that certain worries start disappearing. You no longer walk cautiously in your own mind. You stop preparing defenses for conversations that aren't happening. You stop practicing explanations you don't need to give. You begin recognizing that the exhaustion you once felt wasn't normal. It was a sign of your identity breaking down. The quiet allows your emotional balance to reset, and as it does, your self-worth begins rising quietly, steadily, without needing outside approval. The further you move into this space, the more you realize how much of yourself had been toned down to keep a relationship that demanded constant emotional adjustment. The distance gives you permission to take back pieces of yourself that you had given up. Confidence doesn't return in a single moment. It rebuilds itself through the absence of disorder, through uninterrupted self-reflection, and through the gentle awareness that your identity no longer has to be compromised to keep someone else comfortable. As the quiet stretches longer than the self-absorbed person expected, a predictable pattern begins to appear, the testing stage. Self-absorbed people rarely reappear with responsibility or true self-examination. Instead, they send small signals meant to test your emotional availability without risking their ego. These small signs are not accidental. They are planned attempts to restart the dynamic without having to deal with the break that quiet created. It may start with a like on an old picture, a viewed story, a vague symbol, or an unrelated message that carries no real meaning but plenty of psychological intention. They use lack of clarity as a tool because it allows them to check the situation without committing to being open. These small actions are not acts of care. They are probes designed to measure whether you are still responsive, still reachable, still mentally influenced by their presence. If you reply, they interpret it as confirmation that their control remains in place. If you don't, they intensify. They may send something that triggers a memory, mentioning a time meant to spark emotional softness. They might reach out with a problem, a sudden difficulty that requires your sympathy. They may try to provoke you indirectly by posting something intended to cause jealousy or confusion. Every move is calculated around one central goal: to restart the pattern without acknowledging the hurt or imbalance that led to the quiet in the first place. The testing stage reveals something important about their internal state. They are uncomfortable with the emptiness created by your absence. They want the confirmation that they can still access your emotions whenever they want. This is why these small signs often lack depth, honesty, or clarity. They're not meant to resolve anything, only to re-engage you enough to pull you back into familiar patterns. It's a way for them to regain a position without having to face responsibility or engage in meaningful repair. What often surprises people during this stage is how familiar these actions feel. The small signs are echoes of earlier patterns in the relationship, the sudden warmth after distance, the small gestures after argument, the minimal effort disguised as connection. Quiet disrupts the pattern, but these small signs are the self-absorbed person's attempt to restore it by drawing you back in with the least possible emotional investment. As the quiet continues and the emotional chaos settles, something deep begins to happen on your side that the self-absorbed person never planned for. You start realizing that you have the power to choose the ending, not the reactive ending that happens in the middle of disorder, not the desperate ending that comes after a final argument, but a steady, deliberate, self-guided ending that comes from clear sight instead of confusion. The distance gives you perspective, and perspective gives you control. For so long, the relationship may have felt like something that happened to you, a cycle you kept getting pulled into, a dynamic you were constantly managing, a pattern that consumed your emotional capacity. But quiet shifts that, without the constant pull of their manipulation or the emotional intensity they created. You begin understanding that you are not trapped in their orbit the way you once believed. This realization doesn't arrive all at once. It appears in moments when you recognize that peace feels better than inconsistency, when you feel how much easier your days are without the emotional work they required, when you understand that missing someone is not the same as needing them. Slowly, the strong desire for closure disappears because you no longer want closure from someone who never gave clarity in the first place. Instead, you begin wanting something completely different: stability, self-respect, and emotional safety. You recognize that you have a choice, not just to stay quiet, but to stay free. Meanwhile, the self-absorbed person never expected this shift. In their view of the world, quiet is a temporary tactic or a trick, not a path to gaining strength. They assume you will eventually break, return, or reopen the door. They don't anticipate that quiet could strengthen you. They don't anticipate that distance could heal you. And they definitely don't anticipate that you might choose a future where they no longer have access to you at all. This is the part they cannot control, and therefore the part that makes them the most uneasy. The quiet you both entered for different reasons becomes the turning point for you. It is where confusion disappears, where emotional dependence lessens, and where you recognize that the final choice has always been yours, even if it didn't feel like it before.